Hi, everybody. This is Sue Hyatt with Big Purpose, Big Impact, and I'd like to welcome you to the last webinar in the Volunteer Florida Evaluation Series. I see Kat is on, so I will unmute her and see if she'd like to share anything with you before we get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our last webinar. Sue, thank you for bringing us on this journey this year. We really appreciate it. I've been so delighted by the resources we now have for Florida grantees, and I hope that those of you that are on the webinar or listening to this webinar at a later date have really improved your capacity this year. So thank you, Sue, and thank you to everyone that's joined.
Thank you, Kat. I will mute you back again. Well, it's hard to believe that we're here at the last in the series of 7. As you know, we've gone through sort of a flow chart of what you need to think about as you're designing and implementing evaluations for your program from the very beginning, where thought about what are some things you might want to look at to improve your program or to really document the impacts that you're having with the service your members are providing. We've talked about what are all the different components you need to think about as you put together an evaluation plan. And we've talked about the difference between process and implementation evaluations and outcome or impact evaluations, and what are some considerations to help you think about what's the best one for you to do. I know many of you, if you have less than $500,000 in a year, have opted to do process evaluations, which is certainly allowable under the AmeriCorps guidance and what Volunteer Florida expects. But I know some of the rest of you that have had programs for a while, you're pushing yourself forward and thinking about how to start documenting impact in a different way than just through what your performance measurement outcomes say, by really starting to take a look at what's the impact that your program specifically is leveraging. We've talked about internal and external evaluators and things to think about there. We've talked about budgeting for evaluation and what are the considerations on what things actually cost, what things can you do in some low-cost way. And our last one, we talked about once you have a plan and it's time to actually conduct the evaluation, what are the steps you really need to follow to do it? It's one thing to plan it, but then this isn't a document that's supposed to sit on a shelf. It's supposed to be implemented and be an active thing that you do for your program. So today what we're going to talk about is evaluation reporting and some food for thought on how to use your findings. So specifically, we're going to think back to what was the purpose you had in mind initially for doing your evaluation, and how do you link that with your reporting. We're going to go over what are the basic AmeriCorps evaluation report expectations, what are the components that CNCS looks for when they are looking at an evaluation report, and then we're going to spend some time talking about just some ideas about how you can share your evaluation findings with all the folks in the network around your program. I know sometimes it's hard to think about the report and sharing the findings when, for some of you, you haven't actually conducted your evaluation yet. But I think it is useful to have what I'm going to share with you today in the back of your mind, either as you're planning or implementing your evaluation, because I think sometimes we get stuck in the whole reason to do this is for the report that you're going to turn into Volunteer Florida with your next recompete application, and if you're funded competitively, that goes straight to the corporation with your application. but there's so many other ways to leverage the findings from your evaluation. And I want to make sure that you have some ideas about that, so as you're going through it, no matter where in the development and implementation cycle you are kind of thinking about what are the ways to actually share what you're finding out about your program and what's working, and also what's not working so well. So we're going to also talk a bit about what are some ways to talk about findings that you might have from your evaluation that maybe you found disappointing. You had hoped things were operating more smoothly, or that you were having a bigger impact. So I want to make sure that we have the discussion about what are some ways to handle that, because you don't want to shove it under the rug, but I think there's ways to talk about it from a learning place. So we're going to spend some time with that as well. So as we start thinking about how do you use your evaluation, both the process and then what you find out from collecting information, either about how your program operates or the impact it has on either the environment or the people that you're working with, just want you to remember in the evaluation plan there was a section that you needed to think about what's the purpose for doing this. And of course, one purpose is it's a requirement after your first 3 years that every 3-year grant cycle you do an evaluation. So, I mean, at the end of the day, that's the most basic thing, but it's actually about a whole lot more than that, because no matter what type of evaluation you're doing, whether that's a process evaluation or an impact evaluation, it's all about continuous improving and making sure that you have the information you need for decision making. Do you need to change your model? Do you want to expand your program? And you need to have evidence that it's effective. There's so many purposes behind why you conduct an evaluation. So as you're getting ready to think about using the evaluation, it's really useful to think back, what were you thinking in the first place? Were you really doing this sort of from a monitoring or an accountability place, and that set up part of what data you decided to collect? Were you trying to build your knowledge about how something's working? Or were you really doing it for decision making? Maybe you've got a couple of components of your program and you know that it's not sustainable to kind of split your effort in 2 places. So by digging deeper on one chunk of your program, maybe you've decided that you want to put more effort there and wean members off maybe some of the other things they're doing. So that goes into learning from the data that you collect, like how you can continue to strengthen your program, and just sometimes even understanding how the dots connect is actually an important reason for doing an evaluation. Now this diagram I just want to mention comes from the evaluation reporting guide that the Centers for Disease Control put together, and I included their document as one of the handouts to go along with this webinar material, because even though it's not from the corporation and it's not specifically for AmeriCorps or National Service, I felt like it's a really good basic overview of things to think about as you're writing evaluation reports and then taking what you found and adjusting it to share with different audiences. So that's why I shared that with you, even though it's not a CNCS document. I thought it was a good reference manual, really. So we've talked a lot about process evaluation and impact evaluation. And process evaluation really, at the end of the day, because it's focused on how things are working with your model, between sites, however you frame that, it really is geared towards continuous improvement. So obviously one of the uses from findings from a process evaluation is, what are you going to tweak? Do your members need more training to be more effective in delivering the service. I know there's at least one of you that has focused your process evaluation that way. How do you make sure that members, no matter what skill level they're coming to your program with initially, how do you get them all up to a certain level that when they're sent out to their host sites, they can provide really high quality service to make sure that the folks that they're working with can experience as much positive change as possible. So that's one kind of example. Impact evaluations are looking more for causality. So those of you that are doing impact evaluations, one of the things I know you've been grappling with is how to have a comparison group of people that are really similar to the ones that received the service from your members but that didn't get the service, so that you can track them over time using some of the same measurements you used for the folks that your members are working with. And at the end of the day, what you're hoping is that you see that the folks that members served are better off than the ones that got no additional support. So impact evaluations are really important in this time of really needing evidence of program effectiveness to go beyond what your annual performance measures tell you, to really get at, no, the thing that's making the difference is our program. The people that didn't receive the service, what you're assuming is they're not going to improve as much. So hopefully that's what your results show. But sometimes when you do an impact evaluation, you find that maybe the difference between the two groups isn't as strong as you had hoped it would be. So then that offers the opportunity to really continue to peel that back and try to understand, well, why is that? And what might be factors that contributed to that, and what can we improve moving forward? So no matter which kind of evaluation you choose to do, at the end of the day, it's all about making sure that your program is as strong as possible, and it's most likely from either kind of evaluation that you're going to get some new ideas about how to strengthen your program model, how you bring members on board, everything surrounding how your program operates. So you should recognize this chart. We talked about it back when we were talking about what are the components in an evaluation plan. And I'll just remind you what these three columns are. The far left column, where it says preliminary evaluation plan, the items here come straight out of the AmeriCorps guidance that gets put together about what you need to include in a grant application and for your recompete application. So it's kind of the preliminary plan. It's your best idea of what you're going to do if you get funding for another 3 years. The middle column is the expanded evaluation plan format, and this is what you do once you hear you got funding for another 3 years. It's expected that you'll always take whatever the preliminary plan was in your recompete application, and you have to build it out and expand it and do more thinking about what are you really going to do, develop the tools, do some more research on how other programs have evaluated what they do, and really come up with an evaluation plan that you can implement. So that often happens during year one of the new grant cycle. So the third column on the right-hand side comes from what CNCS says needs to be in an evaluation report. And what I want you to notice here, a couple things, is that the core components between the preliminary evaluation plan and the revised one that you actually implement, the chunks are pretty much the same, except the expectation is you'll build those out a bit more. And what you can also see is as you go over into what are the chunks that people look for in an evaluation report, they're like largely the same as the ones that were in the evaluation plan. So what'll be different here is that for some of it, when you're talking about the evaluation design or sampling methods or tools you used, it may be exactly the same language that you have in your evaluation plan, but you put it in the past tense because you've already done it. So the work you do on getting the evaluation plan set up, serves a couple of purposes. One, it allows you to get your head into what you're going to evaluate and how you're going to do it, but it also provides a template, and that information all moves over into the final evaluation report that you turn in year 3 with your recompete for the following 3-year cycle. The two pieces that are different in the final evaluation plan than evaluation report, excuse me, than in an evaluation plan are the executive summary, and then that you see at the top there, and then the section in yellow at the bottom, which are actually the results. What are the conclusions and recommendations that you have based on what you found out, and what might be some things that you would choose to look at in future evaluations. Sometimes when the findings come in, you're like, wow, not quite sure what that means. I wish we'd asked it this way, or maybe there's some other piece of information that would be helpful to really understand what was going on there that you didn't ask. And that's entirely normal. So that's why a common section in an evaluation report is, well, if you were doing this again, what else would you want to look at? And so it's a nice way to kind of have a forward-thinking, we're a learning organization sort of mindset, as opposed to, oops, we screwed up, we didn't ask about that, we blew it. Well, no, it's always a process of what's the next step. You can't possibly answer every single question you might have in your evaluation, so there's going to be some things based on your findings that you're still curious about, and that's fodder for your future efforts. So let's talk first about the report and who's going to write it. So if you've used an external evaluator, that's usually a piece of what is written into their contract. They help you design it, depending on how you've allocated their time and your time. They help collect the data, or you collect some of it and then they analyze it. But if you can, it's often really good to have an external person review the data and write the report. One tip here is make sure you share with whoever is your evaluator that's going to be helping with the report. Make sure you share perhaps that side-by-side we were just looking at. So they're really, the chunks in there are pretty standard for any evaluation report, but just to make sure that they're on the same page as you, I think it is useful for you to share what you're expecting to see them put in your report. Now, some of the rest of you are not going to be having an external person help with the evaluation because you're doing an internal process evaluation. So I want to talk through a few things that you need to think about, because you're the one most likely that's going to be summarizing the data you've collected and putting it in the report. And for those of you that are thinking, phew, we don't have to write this, somebody else is going to, this is also really important for you to have an understanding of what the results should be looking like basically when you see them in a report. So what I did here, I did the national evaluation for the American Red Cross of the National Response and Prevention Corps, NPRC, National Prevention and Response Corps. And wrote a big old report. So I've pulled out a couple of examples of the kinds of things that I think are really typical to find in an AmeriCorps evaluation report. So if you use some type of online survey tool like SurveyMonkey, which is the one I used to collect data from host site managers and site supervisors, the great news is those software systems, and I shared with you like 4 of the key options back along when we were talking about that. It generates, if you have a fixed choice kind of question where people choose an answer that you've predetermined in a list, the online system will generate a chart for you. And so then all you have to do is either do a cut and paste or a download, and you can put that straight into your report, which actually saves you a bunch of time. And you know, you can pick what colors, but you don't have to do any of the calculations on how many people said what. As you can see in this, you know, one person had been there 7 years or more as a host site manager, and one person had been there for 1 year. So it comes up with a graphical thing really easily. But your job's not done just after that. What you also have to do is put what you see in the chart into words, because some people resonate and know how to understand charts, but other people want to see the words, so you actually have to have both. And you can see in the languaging below the chart some of how I talked about that. So like of the 12, and you can see it says n equals 12, so that means there were 12 people that answered the survey and answered this question. Of the 12 responding, 8% are 1, and then I walked through all the chunks of what's in this chart, so that if the chart wasn't there, somebody could read the paragraph that I wrote and they would get exactly the same data. I know that may seem like double work, but that's really what's expected. There's a graphical piece and then there's a text piece. Sometimes if you don't use an online survey tool, but you do some kind of survey, you might use a scale, for example. So this was a question that was asked to site supervisors about how the members had strengthened Red Cross chapter capacity. And again, there were 12 answers, and people were asked to respond to the specific things that you see down the left. And they could either strongly disagree, disagree, agree, or strongly agree. So what I had to do was go through the 12 forms that came back and tally up how many people responded, as you can see on the screen, disagree, agree, or strongly agree. Nobody strongly disagreed with any of these. And then, so like 10 divided by 12 is 84. I'm looking at the first line here. 1 divided by 12 is 8 to get to 100%. But then also, again, you have to write up the results in text, not just have it in a table. You need to have both chunks. So the ones that I think are a little harder to do and to figure out how to put in an evaluation report are when you've asked an open-ended question and people get to write in whatever they want. Like, those kind of questions are harder to analyze, or they take more time, but you can actually get really, really great information because you're not forcing people to respond to something that may not actually be true for them. They get to say what's top of mind, and sometimes you can get insights that you didn't know about before because you weren't, like the one I showed you a minute ago, kind of forced people to respond to these things. Well, there may have been some other way that members strengthen chapter capacity, but a question like this doesn't actually get to it because they couldn't write it in. So what you have to do with this kind of a question, you read through all 12, and what you're looking for are common themes and how many people mentioned that same theme. So, and then what I usually do is put them, what's the thing that most people mentioned, followed by what was next on down the line. So in this table, you can see that I picked the 5 top things that people said, and I put down, you know, how many people mentioned that, and then did the math. Okay, if 4 people out of 12 said it, that's like basically a third of the folks that responded. So again, underneath the table, you see basically what the table says in text form. But then one of the things that's really useful to do, I think, in an evaluation report is you summarize the data in some tables so people can understand it at a glance. You've got the text for people that prefer to understand it that way. But then in the case of an open-ended question, people will have given you some really interesting quotes that go beyond just saying increased chapter capacity or more projects offered. Like, it gives a different tone, and sometimes whoever's reading the report can get a little bit different sense of what having members at the, in this case at the Red Cross chapter, what that actually meant to them. So like if you see the top comment with a bullet, and I think bullets are great ways to show comments. You know, they said, we're able to provide better, timelier service to our clients. It also allows us to expand programs and projects because of the support. You get a little bit different sense of that than just looking at it in a table by actually putting the actual quote in there. And as you can see, because these are straight off somebody's survey form, I did put quotation marks around the words. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of idea of what the chunks in the evaluation results section look like. Basically what you're going to have is a series of the kind of things I just showed you based on the different questions you asked people or the different things that you were looking at in terms of observation criteria or however else you collected data. And you have some choices to make about how you actually lay that out. Sometimes, like in the case of the Red Cross report, how I set up the results in the report, the first chunk was all about what the host sites felt, and I put the data in there that came from surveys and from interviews and from other documentation that already existed. And then I did a separate section which got at what members thought, because there had been a piece with a member survey and member focus groups and some phone interviews and other online surveys that members had done as part of their regular, the program's regular process. So I split those out into 2 categories based on who were the main people giving the information. That's one way to do it. If you're asking similar questions of different groups, you might choose to have the question and then what, excuse me, can't talk, had too much coffee. What host site supervisors said followed immediately by what members said or by what somebody else said. And then you go on to the next question and you provide both pieces of information. You can do it either way. It just, you have to choose what you think makes the most sense for you to keep your brain around what were you finding out and how might you actually act on that information. Now the next few slides here that I've pulled in to our session today come straight out of CNCS materials from the core curriculum on evaluation about reporting. And I just wanted to make sure that you had exactly what they tell people in addition to some of the additional things that I'm telling you. So what they're really trying to remind everybody, and I 100% agree, is, okay, doing the evaluation report is important, and you go through this whole process. At the end of the day, you have to have a report. It's a compliance thing. It's something you have to turn in, but it doesn't actually stop there. The report is not an end in and of itself. So you really need to take it the next step, which is, as you're putting together the report and looking at what people have actually said or what you've learned from the data you've collected, you have to all the time be thinking, well, what does this mean for us? What are we going to do with these results? How do we translate that into action? What kind of continuous improvements are we going to make? So you have to figure out what your findings are, but then the next step is to really think about what you're going to do with them. So part of that is looking at what's working well already, and maybe what you found is that something at one host site was working really well. So it might be that's kind of some secret sauce that you can then share with other host sites in the hope that they could also implement that and maybe have better impact with the people they're serving. It also helps you see where there might be some components of the program model or what members are doing that isn't as strong as it could be, and those are areas, of course, that then you can tinker with and try to figure out how to improve them. And then there's also what's the action plan that you're going to develop for improvement, so that this just doesn't become kind of an empty exercise. It is something that it's like, how are you going to build it in? Is it going to happen in the next program year or the next 3-year cycle? And kind of who's going to take responsibility? All of those things. What's the timeline? So another important thing as you're looking at the results that you're putting in a report is you got to make sure you refer back to what were your initial evaluation questions that you had in your evaluation plan. And presumably all the data you've collected is designed to answer one of those 3, 4 questions, however many you had. And part of what you're looking for is, did you find out anything that surprised you when you collected the data? Was there something that you found in the results that you're not quite sure what it means? It was a little confusing. So, of course, looking back at your logic model and theory of change can help you understand some of what you're finding, but sometimes you're going to find things that you're not quite sure what they mean. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, that's food for thought to try to figure out now, but sometimes maybe you don't have all the information you need. So maybe that's something that you want to study in a later evaluation. Or maybe you need to collect some more data to help you understand what it all really means. So we've talked about creating an action plan, and then really going, not just, okay, we want to change this, this, and this. It's like really think about what's the timing on that, who's going to do it, what's it going to take to make those changes, what are the implications for how you train members or how you work with site supervisors before members even show up. I mean, any of those things. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about, all right, so you have an evaluation report. That's sort of, in some ways, the generic, just regurgitation of what you collected, what you found, what you think it means, and what you're going to do with it moving forward. But that in and of itself is only one piece of what to do with your results. So the other thing to really think about is who, other than yourself, are the primary users of what you found out, or are there stakeholders that are also need to know about the results and they're going to use them in some way. Because the report is kind of like the summary of everything, but there may be pieces of the report and different findings that you're going to report out differently to different groups of people based on what they need to know and how you think they're going to use that information. Doesn't mean change what you found, but everybody doesn't need to know everything necessarily. Sometimes based on who a given stakeholder is, they may only need to have a slice of what you found out. So that's something you need to think about. Because based on who the audience is, there may be a slightly different message that you need to deliver about the results or context that goes around the results. And part of that is based on what do you think they're going to do once you share with them some of your findings. Do you expect them to do something? Like if it's, for example, if it was something about member supervision and you found out that that members that had a certain level and type of engagement with their supervisor seemed like they were more satisfied and engaged at their service site and actually had better outcomes with the people they're working with. Maybe the message is, okay, you need to meet with your member weekly and whatever other best practices you found out. And the action you're hoping is that they will then think, okay, well, how can I do this? This is what they found out works best, and how can I take this on? And then you have to figure out how you're going to get that information to them and what kind of format is going to be the most easily understood. It's not always, you know, a 30-page document with a lot of words. There may be some other way to present that so that it actually can stick. So as I was just saying, a report is only one way to do it. There's one-pagers, which could be like executive summary. Infographics, the one in the lower right-hand corner, are big right now. There might be a way to pull out individual things you found and do something like the Volunteer Florida piece that was done for a different purpose, but it's a great visual. You could have like something you found out in it, and that could be something you post on social media, and we'll talk a bit more about some options there in a minute. And sometimes having charts with like, okay, here's an overview of your program and what it's designed to do, and then some summary of what you found out and some charts. Sometimes people really respond better and they can understand the relationships between whatever you were looking at by seeing a chart as opposed to just words. So depending on the user, there's different kinds of ways to present the information. You know, there is, I think we all kind of tend to go to what's the written thing look like? What's the report look like? What's an executive summary or a one-pager? What does that look like? But there's also presentations that you might make. You might actually be giving a summary at a meeting or presenting at a conference. And so what do you say and what visuals do you need to help people understand what you're trying to tell them? So one of the handouts I sent to you today is this communications plan as a worksheet that you can use. It's a Word document, so you can type straight in it if it's helpful. But what I want you to think about is who are all the potential audiences that there may be some piece or all of your evaluation findings that you want to be able to share with them. So down the left-hand side, I just did a brainstorm of possible audiences. It doesn't mean you have all of these, but I want you to think beyond just program staff and Volunteer Florida. Like, who else needs to understand what's working and maybe what needs improvement around your program? Like, it may be you all as program staff, but then the organization that you're housed at, maybe their leadership also needs to know what's going on. Maybe it's something that needs to be shared with the board. I think pretty much always sharing with members what you found out is a useful thing. If you have other funders, partners, host sites, community members, you may have some other audiences. So what I want you to do, kind of as your follow-up homework, is think, what are your key audiences once you have evaluation findings? And then I want you to kind of peel back the layers and think about, for each one, what is it that they really need to know? What's going to interest them most? And I noticed one of the things I didn't list here were like policymakers or elected officials. Sometimes they also are an audience for what you're finding out about your program, especially if you're doing an impact evaluation. So I want you to think about, what do they need to know and what would appeal to them? Like, what would they be most interested in? And what do you hope they do once they know that? You know, I think just raising awareness is always a lovely goal, but I think it's much more impactful if there's some call to action in there. So thinking about not just what you want them to know, but then how you want them to support you or actually do something with the findings. Thinking about that, and then what's the best way to share the findings? Is it an executive summary, like board members at your organizations, that goes with your organization? Maybe they're not going to read an entire report. Volunteer Florida, they are. Host sites may not want the full report. So what are the pieces that come out of it that help them understand the impact of what your program's doing, or how they can improve what they're doing so that it's win-win for everybody? So I strongly hope that you will take this template, and I mean, you can put it in some different format, obviously, but really spend some time thinking about who your audiences are, what you want them to know, what you want them to do once they know that, and then the best ways to reach them. So there's some other things to consider. Is everybody doesn't have the same communication method preference. So one thing to look at is, like, if you want members or community members to hear something, you know, these days social media is huge. So it might be putting a snippet up on Facebook of something key that you found out that was positive. Maybe that's a great way to communicate. Like your average community member, you're not going to hand them the full report. You know, what are they going to do with that? And it won't catch their eye. So think about, what are the ways to reach people most effectively? Is that a newsletter? Is that a social media post? Is that a one-pager? And also think that, don't forget, sometimes, I know for some of you, there's a lot of lingo in your field. So some of your audiences may be within your field, and so using lingo is completely appropriate. But if you're trying to appeal to additional funders or others that maybe don't have the same technical background, you got to make sure you translate some of your findings into everyday language so pretty much anybody can understand it, even if they don't have the technical background that you have. Of course, is it culturally appropriate? perceptions and expectations, we kind of just talked about that. And then how do they have enough understanding of the context that you're working in? Like, some of you are working in schools that are really under-resourced, that have high levels of free and reduced lunch, where the bulk of kids say English is not their first language. So if you're talking about findings about how students have improved, you need to make sure that you put enough of a context around that, that people don't read it and think, that don't know anything about the kind of environment you're working in, well, that doesn't seem very impressive, when if they understood more, they would find it very impressive, actually. So just some more examples about how to think those through. I think I've covered those points. Now let's talk a little bit about delivering negative results, because it's such a key thing. It is highly likely that you will find out some things that you're not happy with. And, you know, you can put on your, uh-oh, we need to hide this, we don't want anybody to know. You can go to a fear-based place, excuse me. Or what I actually really encourage you to do is to put on like a curiosity hat. Well, why did this happen? And what does it mean? And how can we use this to be stronger? And under no circumstances should you try to change the data to try to make it look better than it is. I know that sounds weird, and I'm sure you're all sitting there thinking, well, we would never lie or omit, we would tell the truth. But I did some evaluations like 15 years ago for a large organization in DC that dealt with crime prevention stuff, and the evaluation results were not very good. The first round, they found out where there were gaps in the program. They didn't do anything with it, and then the next time they had me do it, there had been like no improvement. And the program director actually called me up and said, could you soften the language in here about recommendations and what wasn't working well, because we could lose $3 million from this report. And you know, that's something you never ask an evaluator to do, because that puts the evaluator in a really bad place. And you know, ethically, I can't do that. You know, we agreed on the questions and the tools, and they knew what I was studying, so I just had to give them the report as it was. How they then frame it, giving it back to their funder, that's a whole other level, because they can then could actually add, okay, here's what we learned from this, and here's our action plan about how we're going to take on the negative findings and make sure that we don't have them again. So just some things to think about, and I also included a handout that I found online that goes into more detail on all of these things. But from the beginning, make sure that what you're designing, other folks know what you're going to be looking at, so that they have some understanding of what you're looking at and why, and maybe even have the conversation up front about what happens if you find out some negative stuff, what you plan to do with that. And one thing to keep your eye on, if you're an internal evaluation person that isn't actually program staff directly, as you start finding out some things that you think aren't as positive as you would have liked, like, this is all like an empowerment process. So don't wait till the final report to have them find out, okay, this didn't happen very well, or these are negative findings. Make sure that you have some dialogue that you say along the way, okay, this isn't looking this good, so what do you think this means? What do you think you might want to do about that in the future? So, you know, don't wait till the last minute and talk about it. And make sure if you're using an outside evaluator, that they know that as they're seeing things good and bad, you want some updates along the way. Don't wait till the final report. Always in the report, emphasize what was positive, but then tell the truth about what wasn't and what you're going to do about it. What are the lessons learned, and what are steps you're going to take to address what wasn't as strong as possible. So how you handle the negative results are actually more important than having like a glow-in-the-dark evaluation report, because there's good learning that can come out of it, and that's why you do evaluation in the first place, is really to make sure everything is as strong as possible. So now I just want to quickly highlight a few things as food for thought about other ways to share your evaluation findings. So those of you that were at the live training at the beginning of this program year that I did in Tallahassee, you remember we spent a section talking about social math. So this again is, many of you already have this handout, but I sent it along as a handout for this webinar as well, because I do think it's really helpful to try to think, how do you present, especially if you were doing an impact evaluation, how do you present some of the findings in a way that really resonates with people? So those of you that were at that training, you will remember that we showed a bunch of diagrams of how you can compare things for people to understand what's going on. So this one is that you can heat 10 two-bedroom homes for 1 year compared to childcare for 2 preschoolers for 1 year, to make the case that preschool education is extremely expensive. So this one isn't as clearly related to an evaluation, but it might be if one of the questions was to really understand the impact of the cost of childcare on people that are trying to put their kids in childcare. We played a video, and if you haven't seen the Minnesota Reading Corps video on YouTube, the URL is there, and that could be something useful to go watch, because they put together a video that talked about their program model, and they showed using social math the need, but then they circled back to it and used social math at the end to talk about the impact that their program was having and how many people had been served under the Reading Corps and the Math Corps. And I think it's a nice sample, so you might want to take a look at that and think about what you might be able to do for your program. Press releases are kind of a standard old school way, really, of sharing some of what the positive impacts are of your program. So I sent you a sample press release template, but local newspapers and city newspapers are only 2 places to put things. A lot of things now, there are online press release sites, but this may not be an appropriate venue to get the word out for some of you. But for some of you it may be, so I wanted to make sure I mentioned it. Infographics are hot right now, and you may look at this and think, there's no way that I can put together something like this. Now, the example that you see on the screen, there's a lot going on that. I don't think it has to be this complicated. But what I do want you to know is the visual piece is actually often very useful to help people understand the kind of impact you're having. And the good news is that there are, and I just picked 5, and I sent you a handout on this as well with their URLs and a little description of what they offer. Free or low-cost online resources where they have templates that you pick, you put your data in, and the online system magically comes up with a cool thing. So I encourage you to take a look at it. I have tried Canva personally, and you know, I think doing that stuff is fun, so it wasn't a big problem learning to use it. But I think this is a cool way to show some of your evaluation results, and you might want to think about checking it out. So I want to, as we're wrapping down, show you some of the things that the corporation has put together that you may have seen on Facebook. And if you haven't, if you go to the AmeriCorps Facebook page, there's a lot of these. I just pulled a few to give you some idea of, okay, how could you take this sort of an approach and do something for your program? So this one, as you can see, was just talking about how many AmeriCorps members projects we're gonna, how many acres of public land AmeriCorps member projects we're gonna deal with. And they put the AmeriCorps logo, a nice picture in the back, and then in this case, because it was National Park Week, they put the logo of the National Park Service. You could do something like this easily for your own program. Here's another one. That on average, Habitat for Humanity affiliates that host AmeriCorps members can build 9 more homes a year and engage nearly 70% more volunteers. So depending on what your evaluation was looking at, if you were looking at, do host sites actually, are they able to do more service and engage more of the community? Here's some great impact data. Good photo, etc. So this was on Facebook. Now here's one. Now both of those other ones, depending on how you look at it, the first one was clearly kind of output information. The second one, depending what their questions were, you could call it output, but it's probably outcome data. So this is also an approach that you could use not just with your evaluation findings, but also with your performance measurement data, and really get yourself some visibility. So this one shows that crime declined by 26% in Detroit neighborhoods where AmeriCorps Urban Safety Program members were serving. And then they went on and calculated the value in terms of savings and law enforcement costs. So this is the kind of approach you could do something like this about yours and have cool photos. So let's kind of break it down. What are the chunks to think about? So if you're going to put something on Facebook or on Twitter or Instagram, you have to have a relevant image that's eye-catching. It's a great opportunity to use the AmeriCorps logo and your program's logo if you have one for that visual recognition. Whatever the data is that you're trying to share. This is an example from Kentucky that Operation Unite, AmeriCorps members led 3,300 Kentucky students in anti-drug education last year. So there's coming up with a graphic, and that's important. Like, what's the message? What's your logo? What's a picture that's eye-catching? But in Facebook, for example, there's also the opportunity to put in a description of what the photo is. And I just want to point out a couple quick things here. Really what they did, they didn't just repeat what was in the visual. They gave a little bit of background in the description. They put in the need and one sentence on the need, one sentence on the intervention. And then they put a link in the second paragraph where somebody can go to get more information. So you can see you can do something like this. And this one has 25 likes on it, but like this one that I just showed you about crime in Detroit, they had 517 people like or engage with this social media post. They got 3 comments, and 199 people shared this visual. So it's a great way to get the buzz going about your program and some of the impact you're having. So I really want you to think about how you could do something similar to this for your own program. So I know we are out of time. So to wrap up, I hope you got some just food for thought about as you head into working on your evaluation with an eye towards what you're going to find out and developing a report. I hope you got some ideas about things you can do to share your results with the different stakeholders that you have that care about your program, that you want to engage and have them support you even more closely. I want to just remind you that this entire webinar series is going to be archived and available on the Volunteer Florida website. So when you're on the website, if you go to the link for national service, then you'll have a series of options as tabs on that page. So if you go to the Technical Assistance tab, you'll see the Florida AmeriCorps Evaluation Resources listed as a section on that tab. And each of these webinar topics is listed, and what you'll find there is the recording of the webinar live, and then all the handouts that were provided excuse me, that go with that topic. So as if you're somebody that hasn't yet had to do some of this, and when it's your turn for your recompete, you're going, whoa, we don't, that was a long time ago when I heard what's in an evaluation plan. Just know that all the materials that we use this year will be available for your use from the Volunteer Florida website. And there's also the National Core Curriculum materials that you can find in the corporation's knowledge network. So that's another great place to look. So if you have any questions about this or anything else about evaluation, please, any of you, feel free to ask me any questions you have. My email is shyatt@bigpurposebigimpact.com, and I'm glad to send back an answer to whatever's up for you. So it's been a pleasure to be able to present this evaluation series to you. I hope you've learned some things and you've gotten a better understanding of not just what the expectations are, but I hope it's built your confidence a little bit that you all can do this, and you can learn some great things about the work your program's doing and how to strengthen your program. And so you don't have to be like afraid of it. You can all do this and do a great job. So thanks for your attention today. Thanks for your participation throughout the series, and hopefully our paths will cross again soon. Take care.